Hi and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing, and today looking at the Easton Mark III Sabre. Now you're joining me out here today because it is a heat wave here, and okay, this is the United Kingdom, but this is not what we're used to, and I can't be in front of studio heating on a day like this, so it's time to be out in the garden and enjoy it a little bit. Okay, so the Easton Mark III Sabre, it's not a production model, although it's about to be sort of any moment now. They're kind of, I believe they're in the middle of shipping, so this was a prototype pre-production model, and our club got 4 of these for testing to see what they were like, and I'm going to give you an overview of what it is, where it came from, how it developed, how good it is, and how it compares to what else is out there. So as a quick overview, what actually is this? Well, Matt Easton at Scholar Gladiatoria has for many years been working to produce what is known as a gymnasium sabre. Now, in 1864, the British Army developed the first practice sabre for the British Armed Forces, and it roughly resembled this. And Matt has been working with lots of different companies, including Red Dragon and Regeni, to try and get a modern training version. Well, it was a training sword, but get a reproduction of that in use, so that you've got a readily available training sword that is actually a recreation of the original training sword. So it's the standard Victorian era British military training sword for practice on foot. Now obviously that's valuable because even though, say, I practice Georgian period military sabre, lots of people do Victorian stuff, and I myself still do plenty of Victorian stuff as well. Now the concept of the 1864, you can see, very much comes from a cavalry sabre that has been reduced in size and weight, and that makes a lot of sense because we know from photographs of the time that they did exactly do that. And this is an example. So this is an 1885 pattern trooper's sabre that has been blunted completely and shortened slightly to make it into an infantry training sword. Now, why would you do that? Well, simply put, the infantry swords of the time had guards that would not withstand regular abuse that a training sword would. As well as the fact that if you blunt them down, you can end up with something a little bit lighter than the real deal. So if you take a cavalry sabre, blunt it, slightly shorten it, you've got something that is roughly of the correct proportions and weight and handling, roughly, of an infantry sword. And the advantage is you've got this really heavy duty bowl guard. Now, bowl guards are fundamentally a good thing. Reason being is they are cheap and easy to produce, they're incredibly strong, they provide good hand protection, so this became a standard for cavalry swords, certainly in the sort of mid 19th century, and they are very successful design, and today you'll see loads of training sabres use this kind of bowl guard. So this is an original that has been converted into a training sword that I do actually still use today, which is why it's got a leather tip on the end. So that's kind of the thing it's replicating. And incidentally, after that, the British Army moved on to things like this. This is also an antique. So this is a training sword for the British Army in the late 19th and early 20th century. And you can see it actually has a rolled or spatulated tip and a nice flexibility. And it's designed to provide lots of hand protection, be nice and safe for training, whilst being still fairly weighty. Although incidentally, although it's as heavy as the converted cavalry sword I just showed you, it's actually quite light in the blade. So this is a time period where the British training swords went longer and lighter, and not just longer and lighter than what came before, but longer and lighter than what was actually being used at the time, which would be the 1892, 95 and 97 pattern infantry officer's sword. So they did go with maybe a bit more of a sportive, lighter, safer approach. Okay, so the bowl hilt, it is very successful, and it's designed to replicate things like the 3-bar and the Gothic hilt sabres, which are of course asymmetric designs for a right-hander, but the bowl hilt is beneficial in that it roughly represents the same thing from a training perspective, but allows ambidextrous usage and just a little bit more hand protection when you are actually in training. So there's a bit of an overview to what it actually is. Now, all sorts of bowl hilt sabres have existed in HEMA for the last, more than 10 years, 10, 15 years, to varying successes. So in our club, we used a lot of Regeni bowl hilt sabres. They were made to our club specification, and they mixed different component parts that he made and modified them to make something that basically best suited the Victorian sabres as we wanted them to, and they were very good. I wouldn't say they were perfect, but they were very good. And sadly, Regeni stopped making them, and the models he does make now are of that type, of the military sabre type, much bigger, much heavier, and just not great. So we haven't been able to get those for quite a few years. And Red Dragon also went out of production, so it's been a dry spell for these bull hilt military sabres. And I know Matt's been working for years to try and get this into production somehow in a good version that has nice flex and a durable guard and good handling characteristics and a good grip. And ultimately, the short story is I think he's got there with it. So, what is so unusual about this sword? Well, the most obvious thing is the dumbbell blade construction. So the dumbbell construction is where you have this wide folded section running the length of the blade. It doesn't always run the whole length, but in the case of this training sword it does, and on the originals it does. And dumbbell because both of the edges are identical. So your front edge is as thick as your back edge. And from a training sword perspective, that has some huge advantages. Simply put, it allows a very, very thick edge on the front, which is where you're taking a lot of edge damage and abuse, which normally most swords aren't going to have, obviously because they go to a cutting edge, or at least the profile of a cutting edge in the case of some blunt swords. So it's a dumbbell construction. What that means is that it's lighter than it looks, because there's a lot of material taken out, despite the fact that you've got some really thick edges. And a lot of dumbbell blades actually ends up very, very stiff, which of course is a concern, and I can tell you outright that that is not a problem with this particular model. This flexes as well as it's really any sabre, any bull-hilted sabre we've ever seen, more so than any we've really seen. It's a really good amount of flex, and you can see at the tip, nice big rolled tip on it. So in terms of a military sabre, that's some of the best flex we've ever seen. So that's absolutely excellent. And the thick edges should ensure that the edges stay really, really in good condition, and so far we've seen almost no damage whatsoever. So that seems to be going well so far, just almost no edge damage whatsoever. So I've not done any maintenance on this blade, and I can just run it up, my hand up and down, no risk of burrs whatsoever. So you've got a very strong edge, very safe for this kind of sword thrust. And just get onto some characteristics of this. The weight. Now we've got 4, the lightest of which was 798 grams. The next up was 814, and the last 2 were 821 grams. So that's the variance that we've seen between the 4 examples, which is quite good. It's perfectly acceptable. And that weight range is also excellent for these kind of military sabres. And so this represents the things that came in 1822 onwards, really. As I said, like the 3 bars and the Gothic hilt sabres and stuff like that. Incidentally, this artillery officer sword I'm holding here, this 3 bar, is 798 grams, so it's identical in weight to one of the 4 that we got in this batch. And it's roughly the same size and same balance, and it generally feels quite close to it, which is quite nice. The bowl. On the first Regeni models, they had quite an enclosing bowl, in many ways a bit like this later Gymnasia sabre, and that's because the groups in Russia that were using them used them with thin leather gloves. Whereas over here, in fact most places using bull hilt sabres prefer something slightly more open that more accurately represents the swords that were being used, and also then allows a Red Dragon glove. And that's essentially a medium weight glove, and the reason that that is advantageous is no matter what bowl you've got, there are some weaknesses, especially the base of the thumb, the wrist, the little finger, the knuckles. So there are some risks there, and having the Red Dragon glove just allows a nice bit of protection on those few gaps that you get with the bull hilt sabre. So this is specifically designed to be used with a medium to large glove. So you can get, in fact, most large gloves in it. I would say the Red Dragon glove is absolutely well suited. Now onto the hilt. You notice this one has a back strap, very nice looking, and a knurled back strap, so that your thumb gets a really nice grip on the back there. I believe that the back strap is not going to be the standard, but it's going to be offered as an option, so you can get one if you want. Personally, I really like back straps because they just look sexy as hell, so I would go for it, even if it's a little bit more expensive. It just looks really, really nice, and it is going to some degree reduce wear on your grip as well, because the thumb is often rubbing on whatever's there. But it's not a big deal. Now the grip shape, notice it has a nicely shaped ergonomic grip, which represents the kind of grip shape that I'm used to seeing with Napoleonic swords, and quite a lot of post-Napoleonic swords had as well. So it does grip nicely. Now the only thing I would criticize the grip for, and this is my personal preference, is I prefer to have cord rather than leather, and there are two reasons for that. One is that it doesn't wear as quickly, and two, I find it grips slightly better. Not exactly a big deal, it's purely optional, and I know they have been working on some cord grips, so you could get, I would imagine, a cord grip on this at some point, but the leather looks quite nice, and you can take this apart and replace it at any time anyway, so it's not exactly a big deal. Now, what else to talk about? Okay, the construction. So up until now, most bowl hilt military sabres were constructed in a peened fashion. Some of the Regenis later on weren't, based on Matt's recommendations. But more recently, companies have been going to using some kind of nut construction, and this does have some major advantages, so long as the tang is strong enough, because some tangs are just weak and flimsy and they're not great, so it's a compromise. But if it's well designed, and a well-designed threaded tang, I've never seen one actually snap, and this so far seems really good. And they use this sunken nut construction, so this nut on here, which conveniently is 12mm, I believe, so you can just get a socket or a spanner on there and easily tighten or take apart the sword. But it's not just what you see on the top there, which is what some manufacturers do. It's actually sunken down to about here. So that means you've actually got a lot of thread being gripped, which is good for keeping it tight, which is quite nice. So they don't come loose too badly. And as I said, you can just keep a 12mm socket or spanner around for quick tightening. The bowl itself is a good shape. It's not excessively large, because I don't like really, really wide guards. Again, look into that later gymnasium sabre, you can see it's absolutely huge to protect the hand. To me, this is more representative of the original swords, and it has a nice rolled edge. So it's a really tough guard, and the rolled edges, they're really thick rolled edges, and you can see how strong it is at the base there, have so far proven to be rock solid. Now our old Regeni guards, they were pretty strong, they weren't this strong. So that's the kind of guard that realistically is going to last forever. And that's nice, because they sell replacement blades for these, so when and if your blades do go, you can put new parts on, which is absolutely ideal. So what else is there to say about this? Well, the blade shape. This is called the Mark III Easton sabre. Technically, in British English, a sabre is curved. This comes up all the time, and yet this one is dead straight. It's not just slightly curved like this, 0.8mm curve of artillery sword. It is actually dead straight. Now that means it's not technically a sabre, but in the time that these were made, the not just the training swords, but the actual fighting swords, they did offer straight, light curve and more heavily curved options. The light curve was the most common type, but you'll see quite a variety. And Kvetun are going to be offering a straight, light curve and heavy curve option. I have got a heavy curve type of this blade on a custom hilt already, so that's going quite well. I haven't yet seen the lightly curved blade, but I'm sure it'll be perfectly good. I've seen the lightly curved of the older type that they made. Okay, so the blade length. It's about 34 inch, which I wish they'd gone more like 33, but I know Matt's reasonings for that, and I'm okay with that. It's not the end of the world. The balance and the weight is all good for the original swords. They do weigh and feel like an awful lot of original swords, like the artillery sword I just offered you here, and there were heavier examples than this historically as well. So the weight, the handling characteristics, the grip shape, the overall feel, the flexibility, all really, really good. They do hit reasonably hard, although that's kind of a characteristic of a full weight military sabre. That's kind of the norm. I don't think they hit excessively hard, but is something to bear in mind. And just overall, I really, really like them, and I can see an awful lot of potential for this blade in this form. It's perfect to go on a basket hilt, to basically be used as a backsword or broadsword training blade. It'll be perfect for that. It's the right size. It would just be a nice, sort of fairly light backsword broadsword blade. If it was shortened just a slight amount, it would be a great spadroon blade. So I can see a lot of potential with this blade. It's a really, really nice blade to train with, and overall, it's just proven to be a dependable, reliable, and fun sword to use. So, yeah, I would personally prefer a cord grip, but it's a minor deal. I've got a selection of different grip types, and that's fine. And I wish it was 1 inch shorter, but I'm absolutely fine with that. And therefore, my opinion is that it's just an absolute excellent training sword, and it's what we've been after for years, essentially. And again, you might think, okay, I do Georgian or Napoleonic era military saber, and therefore we don't use ball hilts, but it's not necessarily strictly true, because for a start, the manuals that we work from, they were still being used when these new swords were coming into use. So, it's all still legitimate for what we're doing. And also, and there's an interesting point, 2 things this does represent quite well is, one, a 1796 heavy cavalry officer's sword, because that wasn't the type the Sharp carried. That was the trooper's version. The officer's version had very much what's called a ladder hilt, so like this, but all pierced. And they usually were roughly this size and roughly this weight and handling characteristics. So if you want a heavy officer's sword, this actually represents it really quite well as well. That's quite nice for me as someone who practices Napoleonic stuff. And the other consideration is it's sort of like a steel single stick. Now, going back into the 18th century, the standard training tool for broadsword and saber and spadroon, for that matter, was the single stick. And a single stick is just a stick or stave with some kind of basket on it, usually made of leather, possibly wicker as well. And as this is a sort of, completely dead straight, ball-hilted protection, sort of generic sword for the time, it is a bit like a steel single stick, if you get my meaning, which means it's sort of a good generic military training sword, or for that matter, backsword, broadsword for the 18th century. So it's a good sort of all-round generic useful training sword that could represent quite a lot of things, and therefore I'm absolutely loving them. We are using them a lot. We're giving them some heavy abuse. We haven't taken any blade sets, we haven't taken any blade damage, we can't dent the bowls. So, they've been a really big hit, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of them. I would personally like a lightly curved version of this blade on this hilt, just because, to me, I like lightly curved blades of the Victorian era, and I like heavily curved blades of the Georgian period. So, yeah, I'd like a lightly curved blade as well. Although I will simply say that a straight blade can actually be very good. It's interesting how you can, from a military saber perspective, drop the point in, whether you're using the point or the edge, and get it to the target quicker with the straight blade. It's quite interesting. So it is beneficial at times to use the straight blade, and it's quite interesting. Of course, yeah, we do use straight blades on basket hilts, I do, but they're usually slightly restrictive in their hilts, so you can't grip a lot of them like this. Anyway, that's a long-winded first review of the Kvetun Mark III Easton sabers, and my opinion is they are absolutely excellent. They are really good, and I would absolutely recommend them. I'm really looking forward to see what else they do with this blade as well. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please do subscribe if you haven't already.